I'm a 33-year-old man married to my wife Diana, who's 35, and we have a 4-year-old daughter, Sophie. Diana and I have been together for 8 years, married for 5. For the most part, life is good. But there's one constant source of stress in my life, my mother-in-law. She's a retired teacher, and let's just say she hasn't quite left her teaching days behind. Everything about her screams expert, whether it's parenting advice, cooking tips, or her unsolicited thoughts on how we're ruining Sophie's potential. It all came to a head during Thanksgiving this year, and now I'm wondering if I handled it all wrong. My mother-in-law has always been opinionated, but it's the way she talks about my parenting that drives me insane. Sophie is a sweet, smart kid. She's shy in loud or unfamiliar settings, but she's great when she's comfortable. My mother-in-law thinks Sophie's shyness means we're coddling her too much. She says things like, when I was teaching, kids like Sophie didn't need coddling, they needed structure. Or if you don't toughen her up, the world will eat her alive. It's constant, and no matter how much I try to brush it off, it sticks. Diana is a peacekeeper. She loves her mom, but she knows how her mom can be. Anytime I vent to Diana, she'll just sigh and say, that's just how she is, like it's supposed to make everything okay. I get it. She doesn't want to rock the boat, but it leaves me feeling like I'm the only one trying to keep some sanity in this house. Thanksgiving was mother-in-law's idea, as always. She loves hosting and always makes a big deal out of it. This year, she framed it as an opportunity for Sophie to learn some proper table manners. Red flag, right? Still, we decided to go, thinking, what's the worst that could happen? The day started off stressful enough. I spent the morning prepping Sophie. She's at that age where new foods are a hard sell, so I practiced with her polite ways to say no, how to handle small talk, and even some basics about eating with a fork and knife, which she's still figuring out. She was nervous, but I reassured her it'd be fine. I even let her pick out her own dress, a cute pink outfit she loves. I thought she looked adorable. The moment we walked into mother-in-law's house, she took one look at Sophie and made a face. That's what she's wearing? She asked, her voice dripping with disapproval. I didn't even have time to respond before she turned to Diana and said, I thought you'd dress her for the occasion. Strike one. Sophie didn't catch the comment, thankfully, but I did, and I could feel my blood pressure rising already. Things only got worse at dinner. Mother-in-law had made an elaborate spread, turkey, stuffing, green bean casserole, pumpkin pie, you name it. It was impressive, but Sophie, like a lot of kids her age, is a picky eater. As soon as we sat down, mother-in-law started in, Sophie, try some of the turkey. Oh, and the stuffing, this is the best part. You need to eat your vegetables too. Sophie shook her head politely, saying she didn't like some of the dishes. Mother-in-law wasn't having it. She kept pushing and Sophie's no thank you turned into her clamming up completely. Then mother-in-law pulled the classic line, you can't leave the table until you try a little bit of everything. Diana and I exchanged a glance, and I told Sophie she didn't have to eat anything she didn't want to. That didn't sit well with mother-in-law. The breaking point came with dessert. Sophie doesn't like pumpkin pie, and she was already overwhelmed from being pushed all night. Mother-in-law insisted she at least try a bite and wouldn't drop it. Sophie started tearing up, then full-on crying. Mother-in-law threw up her hands and said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, this is what happens when you're too lenient. You're failing as a parent, and Sophie's the one paying for it. I snapped. I told her to back off and leave Sophie alone. Mother-in-law looked stunned for a moment, then furious. She got up, said something about how I'd disrespected her in her own home, and stormed out. The rest of the night was a blur. Diana and I cleaned up while Sophie sat quietly, playing with her napkin. On the drive home, Diana suggested I should apologize to mother-in-law to keep the peace. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Now mother-in-law isn't speaking to me. She's called Diana a few times to vent, painting herself as the victim, and Diana's stuck in the middle. I'm standing firm that I did the right thing by standing up for Sophie, but now I'm wondering if I overreacted. Was I too harsh? Should I have just let it go? Or is mother-in-law completely out of line? I don't know anymore, and I need some outside perspective. Am I being too sensitive? Or is mother-in-law really the problem here? Update 1. The fallout from Thanksgiving hit hard and fast. The morning after, Diana sat me down at the kitchen table while Sophie played quietly in the living room. Diana said her mom was really hurt by what happened and thought an apology could smooth things over. I stayed calm and told her that wasn't going to happen. I wasn't going to apologize for standing up for Sophie. Diana looked torn but didn't push further, at least not at that moment. That afternoon, the phone calls started. Mother-in-law was in full damage control mode, ringing up every relative who'd listen. She called Diana first, of course, and by the time Diana got off the phone, I could tell it had been a long conversation. Mother-in-law had spun the story completely in her favor, painting me as aggressive and disrespectful in her home. Diana relayed some of it, trying to stay neutral, but the word controlling came up more than once. By the end of the weekend, extended family members started chiming in. Diana's aunt called, gently suggesting that maybe I should let bygones be bygones because mother-in-law was just trying to help. Her cousin sent a text about respecting elders and how family harmony was important. Meanwhile, a couple of Diana's siblings texted her directly, saying they understood why I snapped and that mother-in-law had overstepped. It felt like lines were being drawn, and I was at the center of it. Sophie, who's usually so bubbly, started acting different. She was quieter than usual and kept asking if she was being bad. It broke my heart. She didn't need to be caught in the middle of all this. I decided to book a session with a family therapist. I wanted professional advice on how to handle mother-in-law, but more importantly, how to make sure Sophie felt safe and supported through all this. While I was trying to take constructive steps, mother-in-law wasn't slowing down. She posted a Facebook status that made my blood boil. Some people don't appreciate good parenting advice, even when it's for their child's benefit. Sad to see family torn apart over such pettiness. She didn't name names, but it didn't take a detective to figure out who she was talking about. The comments were full of sympathy for her, with people calling her a dedicated grandma and offering prayers for her difficult situation. I showed it to Diana, expecting her to agree that it was crossing the line, but instead she shrugged and said I should just ignore it. That was the last straw for me. I pulled out my phone and sent mother-in-law a text, I will not tolerate any more criticism of my parenting. If you have an issue, address it with me directly, not on social media or through family gossip. I left it at that. Mother-in-law didn't reply to me. Instead, she called Diana, saying I was alienating her from her granddaughter. That same evening, she showed up at our house unannounced with a big bag of gifts for Sophie. She barely acknowledged me when I opened the door, brushing past to find Sophie, who was sitting on the couch coloring. Sophie lit up at the sight of the presents, but I could see the strings attached. Mother-in-law acted like I wasn't even in the room, chatting with Sophie and handing her toy after toy, while ignoring me completely. When Diana got home from running errands, she seemed surprised to see her mom there. Mother-in-law stayed for another hour, long enough to give Sophie a hug and whisper something in her ear before leaving. Sophie later told me her grandma had said she missed her and wished she could see her more often, which only added to the mess. At our therapy session, I laid everything out. The therapist listened carefully and validated that mother-in-law's behavior was crossing boundaries. She also pointed out something I hadn't fully acknowledged. Diana's tendency to avoid conflict might be enabling her mom. The therapist suggested we both come back for a session together, so Diana could learn how to set boundaries and support our family unit. Reddit had already weighed in by this point. I'd shared the Thanksgiving story, and the response was overwhelming. Commenters were divided on whether Diana was enabling mother-in-law or just caught in the middle, but the consensus was clear: mother-in-law was out of line, and I needed to stand firm. Several people shared their own experiences with overbearing family members, which gave me some ideas on how to approach things moving forward. By the end of the week, I felt more resolved than ever to confront mother-in-law directly. I couldn't keep tiptoeing around her behavior, and I needed Diana to be on the same page. This wasn't just about me, it was about protecting Sophie from the constant pressure and guilt tripping. Mother-in-law wasn't going to back down on her own, so I had to take the next step. I'm ready to have this confrontation, but I'm bracing myself for whatever fallout might come next. Update 2. After everything that happened, Thanksgiving, the unannounced visit, and mother-in-law's passive-aggressive social media posts, I decided it was time to confront her directly. This situation wasn't going to fix itself, and I was tired of the tension spilling into every corner of my life. Diana was hesitant, but I told her this was non-negotiable. Mother-in-law needed to hear how her actions were affecting Sophie and our family. Diana reluctantly agreed, but only if she could be there to mediate. I wasn't thrilled, knowing how often Diana defaulted to appeasing her mom, but I agreed. We called mother-in-law and invited her over for a conversation. She sounded cold on the phone, but said she'd come by that weekend. When mother-in-law arrived, she looked prepared for battle. She wore one of her fancy scarves and had that tight-lipped smile that always screamed polite hostility. She walked in with a tray of cookies, handed them to Sophie, and made a comment about how at least grandma can spoil her a little. Sophie ran off to play, and the three of us sat down in the living room. The air was thick with tension. I started the conversation carefully, explaining that we wanted to talk about boundaries and how some of her comments and actions had been hurtful. Before I could get far, mother-in-law interrupted with a sharp laugh and said, "Oh, don't tell me you're still upset about Thanksgiving. You're so sensitive." She leaned back on the couch, waving her hand dismissively. "I only want what's best for Sophie." I stayed calm and explained how her constant criticism was making Sophie anxious and how the unannounced visits were disruptive to our family. She folded her arms and said, "Well, someone has to look out for Sophie. Clearly, you're not doing it." She kept pointing out small things, how Sophie's shy behavior was because we coddled her too much, and how her picky eating was because we didn't teach her discipline. Diana tried to step in, but instead of supporting me, she started agreeing with some of mother-in-law's points. "Mom's just trying to help," she said. That's when I realized this wasn't going to go the way I hoped. I stood firm and told mother-in-law that what she saw as help was actually undermining my parenting. I pointed out specific examples: the Thanksgiving meltdown, the Facebook post, and her unannounced visit. But instead of acknowledging anything, mother-in-law's eyes started watering. Within seconds, she was full-on crying. "I can't believe this," she sobbed. "I've done nothing but try to help, and this is how you treat me. You're turning Diana against me." She grabbed a tissue from her bag and dabbed at her eyes dramatically, muttering about how she's not even allowed to see her granddaughter without being made to feel like the bad guy. Diana froze, clearly uncomfortable, and just muttered something about how no one was trying to push mother-in-law away. Mother-in-law turned to me and said, "I've never seen someone so determined to destroy a family." That's when Diana snapped at both of us, saying she was tired of being stuck in the middle. "You two need to figure this out," she said. "I can't take this anymore." Mother-in-law stood up, shaking her head. "Fine," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and sadness. "I won't bother Sophie anymore. Clearly I'm not wanted here." She grabbed her bag and walked out without looking back. The house was silent for a few minutes after she left. Sophie peeked out from her room, holding one of the cookies mother-in-law had brought, and asked if grandma had gone home. Diana nodded and told Sophie everything was fine, but the tension was palpable. That night, Diana and I argued. She accused me of escalating the situation, saying I should have let some things go for the sake of keeping peace. I reminded her that peace shouldn't come at the expense of Sophie's well-being. She stormed off to bed, leaving me on the couch to replay everything in my head. The next day, mother-in-law's absence was noticeable. No texts, no phone calls, no surprise visits. But then the passive-aggressive texts started. "I hope Sophie is okay without her grandma in her life," one read. Another said, "You're pushing me away, but one day Sophie will ask why I'm not around." Diana told me to ignore them, but I saved each one. In therapy, the counselor pointed out how mother-in-law's behavior was manipulative and how Diana's neutrality was enabling the problem. She suggested Diana needed to prioritize our family unit over her mom's feelings, but it was clear Diana wasn't ready to hear that yet. Reddit was split on their advice. Some commenters supported me, saying mother-in-law's actions were toxic and Diana needed to step up. Others suggested mother-in-law's emotional hold on Diana might be too strong to break without serious effort. A few asked if I'd considered what this dynamic meant for my marriage long-term. It was food for thought. I'm not sure where things go from here, but one thing is clear, this isn't sustainable. If mother-in-law doesn't change, and if Diana doesn't start supporting me instead of placating her mom, I'm not sure how much longer I can keep this up. Something has to give. Update 3. After the confrontation with my mother-in-law and the fallout that followed, I realized we couldn't keep going like this. The constant tension wasn't fair to Sophie, and it was affecting our home life more than I cared to admit. I decided to enforce stricter boundaries, starting with no more unannounced visits. I told Diana that from now on mother-in-law couldn't just show up whenever she pleased. Diana agreed in theory, but her hesitation was obvious. A few days later, I texted mother-in-law directly. I kept it short and clear. Any future visits needed to be planned in advance. Her response was instant. She called me controlling and accused me of ruining family traditions. She also claimed I was alienating Sophie from her grandmother, which I ignored. I thought that would be the end of it, but I underestimated how far mother-in-law was willing to go. About a week later, I came home from work to find mother-in-law in our living room. Diana was sitting on the couch, looking uncomfortable, while Sophie was on the floor opening a brightly wrapped box. Mother-in-law had brought over a pile of gifts, including an expensive dollhouse and several toys. I asked Diana what was going on, and she admitted mother-in-law had called earlier, asking to stop by. Diana had reluctantly agreed, knowing I wouldn't approve. The note that came with the gifts was the final straw. Mother-in-law had written, "For Sophie, since I'm not allowed to see her anymore. Love, Grandma." It was a clear jab at the boundaries I'd set, and I wasn't going to let it slide. After mother-in-law left, I packed up the gifts and told Diana we were returning them. Sophie didn't understand why, but I sat her down and explained that gifts from Grandma needed to come with our permission. She nodded quietly, and we dropped everything off at mother-in-law's house the next day. Mother-in-law was furious. She called Diana multiple times, demanding an explanation. When Diana didn't give her the answer she wanted, mother-in-law took to Facebook. She wrote a long post about daughters-in-law ruining families and how some people don't appreciate grandmothers who just want to love their grandkids. The post was full of vague accusations but didn't name names. Still, it didn't take long for extended family to start reaching out. Some supported me, saying mother-in-law had overstepped, while others said I was being too harsh and should let it go for the sake of family peace. At the same time, Sophie seemed to be doing better. Without mother-in-law's constant interference, she was more relaxed and less anxious. Her teachers even mentioned she seemed more confident in class. That gave me some reassurance that I was doing the right thing, but things at home were getting harder. Diana started accusing me of creating unnecessary conflict. She said I was being too strict with the boundaries and that mother-in-law's intentions were good. I told her this wasn't about good intentions, it was about respect. One night, after another argument, Diana told me she couldn't take the fighting anymore. She said if I didn't ease up, she might have to stay with her mom for a few days to clear her head. I told her that if she did, she needed to think long and hard about what kind of family she wanted to build. That seemed to hit a nerve, and she stayed, but things between us were colder after that. Meanwhile, mother-in-law wasn't done stirring the pot. She started a full-on smear campaign, reaching out to anyone who would listen. She even sent a letter to Sophie's school, claiming she was being kept away from her granddaughter and asking for updates on Sophie's well-being. The school called me immediately, and I went in to explain the situation. They reassured me they wouldn't share any information with mother-in-law and noted the incident in their records. At this point, I decided to consult a lawyer. I wanted to know what legal steps I could take if mother-in-law kept escalating. The lawyer advised me to document everything: texts, social media posts, unannounced visits, just in case we needed to file for a restraining order or send a formal cease and desist. It wasn't a step I wanted to take, but it felt necessary with the way things were heading. In therapy, the counselor brought up something I hadn't fully considered. Diana's relationship with her mom might be more than just loyalty. She suggested that Diana could be emotionally dependent on mother-in-law, which explained why she struggled to set boundaries or fully support me. That revelation hit hard. For the first time, I started questioning if Diana and I were truly on the same team. The breaking point came a week later. Mother-in-law showed up at Sophie's school unannounced, claiming she was there to pick her up. Luckily, the school followed protocol and called me right away. I rushed over, and by the time I arrived, mother-in-law was arguing with the front desk staff. When she saw me, she stormed out, muttering something about how I was poisoning Sophie against her. That night, I told Diana this couldn't go on. Either we enforced boundaries as a united front, or I would take whatever steps were necessary to protect Sophie, even if that meant involving the courts. Diana didn't respond, but the silence said enough. I'm done prioritizing mother-in-law's feelings over my family's well-being. This is the line in the sand, and I'm not backing down. Update 4. After mother-in-law's stunt at Sophie's school, I took immediate action. I met with the school administration the next day and explained the situation in detail. I gave them a list of authorized people who could pick Sophie up, and mother-in-law's name was not on it. The school was very understanding and assured me they'd enforce the policy. They even added a note to Sophie's file, flagging any attempts by mother-in-law to contact her. Of course, mother-in-law didn't take this lightly. The very next day, she called Diana to complain. She accused me of alienating her from her granddaughter and said I was being unreasonable. Then she dropped the bombshell she was considering legal action for visitation rights. Diana told me about the call later that evening, looking stressed but not entirely surprised. I scheduled another meeting with the lawyer, who reassured me that mother-in-law didn't have much of a case. We had a strong argument. Mother-in-law's interference was disruptive, and there was no established pattern of visitation that would warrant court involvement. Still, the lawyer suggested we send a formal cease and desist letter to mother-in-law, making it clear that her behavior needed to stop or we'd pursue legal action ourselves. I agreed, though I knew this would only escalate things. Meanwhile, Diana and I were drifting further apart. She thought the legal approach was too extreme and accused me of overreacting. To make matters worse, mother-in-law started calling Diana every day, spinning stories about how I was tearing the family apart. Diana was stuck in the middle, and instead of taking a firm stand, she kept trying to pacify both sides. A week later, during a joint therapy session, everything came to a head. The therapist asked Diana how she felt about her mom's behavior and what role she wanted to play in setting boundaries. Diana hesitated, then admitted she felt torn. She said she didn't want to alienate her mom, but also didn't want to jeopardize our marriage. When the therapist asked Diana to choose a priority, our family unit or her mom, Diana deflected, saying she didn't want to pick sides. That session felt like a turning point, but not in the way I'd hoped. Diana's inability to commit to boundaries made it clear she wasn't ready to change. The therapist suggested we take some time to think about what we each wanted, but by then it felt like the damage was already done. 2 days later, mother-in-law sent me a text that started off sounding like an apology. She wrote that she'd been too emotional and let her love for Sophie cloud her judgment. But as the text went on, it became clear it wasn't a real apology. She blamed me for overreacting and accused me of driving a wedge between her and Diana. I didn't respond. That evening, Diana dropped another bombshell. She thought it would be best if she and Sophie stayed with her mom for a few days while things cooled down. I told her that wasn't happening. If she wanted to go, fine, but Sophie wasn't going anywhere near mother-in-law's house. Diana accused me of being controlling and stormed out of the room. She stayed, but the tension between us was unbearable. A few days later, I came home from work to find Diana packing a bag. She said she needed space to think and was going to stay with her mom for a few nights. I asked her what that meant for our marriage, and she didn't answer. She kissed Sophie goodbye, said she'd call every day, and left. The next few days were eye-opening. Without mother-in-law's interference or Diana's constant back and forth, the house felt calm for the first time in months. Sophie seemed happier and more relaxed. She spent her evenings drawing and telling me about her day at school without the shadow of mother-in-law looming over us. It was a stark contrast to the chaos we'd been living in. Meanwhile, mother-in-law doubled down on her social media antics. She posted long, dramatic updates about losing her son to a vindictive woman and how she prayed for the strength to heal her broken family. Some relatives sided with her, but others were reaching out to me privately, offering support. A few even apologized for not seeing the full picture sooner. I met with the lawyer again, who drafted a cease and desist letter to mother-in-law. It outlined her overstepping behavior, including the school incident, and warned her to stop or face legal consequences. The letter was sent by certified mail, and I was told to expect backlash. Throughout all of this, my friends and family rallied around me. They reassured me I was doing the right thing and offered to help in any way they could. One friend even offered to babysit Sophie if things got overwhelming, which was a lifesaver. I've realized I can't keep prioritizing mother-in-law's feelings, or even Diana's indecision, over Sophie's well-being. If Diana can't stand with me as a partner, then I'll have to make some hard decisions. For now, I'm focusing on protecting Sophie and building a peaceful, stable environment for her. This fight isn't over, but I'm ready for whatever comes next. Update 5. After months of escalating drama, I finally hit the point where I knew something had to change for good. I filed for legal separation from Diana. I cited her inability to set boundaries with her mother as the Priyanna issue. And while it wasn't an easy decision, it felt like the only way forward. When Diana received the paperwork, she was shocked. She hadn't believed I would take such a definitive step, and it led to yet another argument. She insisted we could work things out and begged me to reconsider, promising that she'd finally enforce boundaries with her mom. I didn't waver. I told her it was too late. For years, she had chosen to appease her mother over standing by me, and I wasn't willing to put Sophie through that any longer. Diana moved back to her mother's house, which only seemed to fuel mother-in-law's anger. The moment mother-in-law found out about the separation, she unleashed a torrent of blame, claiming I was vindictive and tearing the family apart. She started reaching out to extended family members, spinning the story as if I'd forced Diana out and taken Sophie away from her. Despite the noise, Sophie and I found a new sense of peace. With just the two of us in the house, I established a structured, calm routine. Sophie flourished. She slept better, her anxiety decreased, and she even started making more friends at school. It was a stark contrast to the tension-filled environment we had been living in before. Seeing her thrive confirmed I'd made the right choice. Mother-in-law wasn't done, though. She started sending Sophie letters and gifts through the mail, often including notes that hinted at me being the reason they couldn't see each other. Grandma loves you and misses you so much, one card read, but Daddy won't let me visit. I didn't let Sophie see any of it. I returned everything unopened and contacted my lawyer to document the attempts. To ensure Sophie's safety, I worked with her school to implement stricter security measures. Mother-in-law's name had already been flagged, but now I added a formal notice from my lawyer stating she had no permission to contact Sophie on school grounds or anywhere else. The school was fully on board and assured me they'd notify me immediately if mother-in-law attempted anything. Sophie and I also started attending therapy together. I wanted her to have a safe space to process everything and learn tools to rebuild her confidence. It worked wonders. She opened up more during our sessions, and her therapist commented on how resilient she was. Slowly but surely, the weight of the past few months began to lift. Meanwhile, mother-in-law's retaliation escalated. She met with a lawyer, claiming she had grandparents' rights and wanted visitation with Sophie. When my lawyer reviewed the claim, he assured me it was baseless. Mother-in-law didn't have any substantial involvement in Sophie's life that would warrant court-ordered visitation, especially given her recent behavior. The threat didn't go anywhere, but it was another reminder of how far mother-in-law was willing to go to assert control. Diana and I remained in contact, mostly about Sophie. She struggled to adjust to life at her mom's house and often called to check in. A few weeks after moving out, Diana told me she was finally cutting contact with her mother. She admitted mother-in-law's behavior had crossed too many lines, and she didn't want to lose Sophie entirely. It was a step in the right direction, but for me, it was too little, too late. The damage had already been done. The extended family split in two. Some relatives, tired of mother-in-law's antics, distanced themselves from her entirely. Others clung to her version of events, blaming me for the fallout. I stopped engaging altogether. I wasn't going to waste time trying to convince people of the truth. Sophie and I had our lives to focus on, and that was enough. My mother-in-law had a minor health scare around this time, which she used as another attempt to pull Diana back in. She called Diana from the hospital, claiming she needed her baby girl by her side. Diana visited but didn't stay long. Later, she told me it felt like just another manipulation tactic, and I couldn't help but agree. As for me, I started focusing on the future. I applied for a new job that would allow me to work from home, giving me more time with Sophie. When I got the offer, it felt like a fresh start. I also leaned on my support system, friends, family, and even Reddit commenters who reminded me I wasn't alone. Their encouragement made a world of difference. Diana eventually started therapy on her own. She apologized for not standing by me earlier and said she wanted to be a better co-parent for Sophie. I told her I appreciated the effort but made it clear that our relationship was over. For the first time, she didn't argue. Looking back, I can see how far we've come. Setting boundaries with mother-in-law wasn't easy, and neither was letting go of my marriage, but it was worth it. Sophie's happiness and well-being come first, and I finally feel like I'm in a place where I can give her the stability she deserves. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that standing firm isn't about being harsh, it's about protecting what matters most.